All right, so Edgar Allan Poe. We're diving into his world today, and you've given us quite the collection of his work.
Yeah, as you know, he was more than just spooky stories.
Right, but I will say, fair warning to our listeners, he might just make you question your own sanity by the end of this deep dive.
Yeah, definitely, and for good reason, I think. Well, there's a reason his work has resonated for so long. It's not just about cheap thrills or anything. It's about the darkness he unearths in the human experience, something we all connect to.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. One thing that jumps out from all this material is Poe's fascination with obsession. It's like a character itself, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's the engine, really, driving the plot forward. And not necessarily it like a straightforward way either. Often it's headed towards collapse, a disintegration of the self even.
Yeah, like in The Telltale Heart, where that poor old man's eye isn't just an eye anymore, it's this all-consuming force for the narrator. Why do you think Poe latches onto that image specifically, that fixation on something so specific?
It's interesting, right? Because it's not really about the eye itself, is it? It's this kind of projection of the narrator's own fears, his guilt. That eye becomes this symbol of everything eating away at him from the inside. And, it gives him no peace until he's driven to the brink of madness. That's classic Poe, though, right?
Yeah.
Making the internal external
Yeah.
and utterly terrifying.
It's true, and that ties into another one of Poe's trademarks, I think, this blurring of sanity and madness. Like his characters are often right on the edge, one bad decision away from a complete psychological freefall.
Totally. The human psyche under duress, that fascinated Poe, that fragility of our mental states. He wanted to explore what happens when guilt festers, when paranoia takes root, and how that can completely consume a person from the inside out.
And he does not shy away from the gruesome details either. Like in The Black Cat, how just burying a horrific act doesn't make it go away. If anything, for Poe, it seems, it often makes things a whole lot worse.
Exactly. That feeling of being trapped by your own actions, by the past, that's huge in Poe. And again, it's not just about the act itself, but the psychological weight of it, the echo, if you will, that can be even more destructive than the actual event. But speaking of haunting, we can't talk about Poe without talking about death. He seems obsessed with mortality, with decay, and that unsettling nature of whatever might be waiting on the other side.
Oh, absolutely. You're not kidding. The facts in the case of M. Valdemar is a great example of that. Death isn't just an event in that story. Poe makes it a visceral experience for the reader. And the way he uses clinical language, almost like a scientific textbook, to describe decay,
Yeah.
it's so unsettling.
Right. It makes the unreal feel real. And that's such a great example of Poe's scientific side kind of bleeding into his work. It wasn't all just ghosts and ghouls with him. He was really interested in the mechanics of life and death, even if those interests were sometimes rooted in the, shall we say, more dubious science of his time.
Yeah, it's like he uses those clinical details to almost like ground the story in something we recognize, right? The physical reality of the world, and then twist it into something truly disturbing.
Exactly. And that's maybe why he's able to tap into those primal fears so effectively. It's not just about what's lurking in the shadows. It's the fear of what's happening inside, what our own bodies are capable of.
Speaking of shadows, though, Poe had a real knack for creating these incredibly creepy atmospheres. Like
Yeah.
he could make a dungeon feel like the most terrifying place on Earth.
Oh, totally. The Pit and the Pendulum, right?
Yeah.
Perfect example. That
Yeah.
slow, agonizing descent into darkness, the looming threat of the pendulum, just pure psychological torture.
Oh, for sure. You can practically feel the dampness of the dungeon walls, Hear the rasping breath of the narrator as he tries to escape. It's like he doesn't just tell you a story, he drops you right in the middle of it.
Absolutely. He was a master of using setting to really manipulate the reader's emotions. And think about how often his characters are trapped, whether physically or mentally. That sense of claustrophobia, of being closed in, it's practically a character itself in a lot of his work.
Oh, totally. And then, just when you think you're getting a handle on the story, he throws in this other curveball, the unreliable narrator.
Oh, yeah, classic Poe.
Right. You start to realize that the person telling the story might be completely unreliable.
The cask of Amontillado immediately comes to mind. Montresor, our narrator, leading Fortunato to his doom, brick by brick. But we only have his word to go on, right?
It's true.
So is this really about revenge? Or is it something else? Something way more sinister, something twisted in Montresor's own mind. It's brilliant because Poe never really lets us fully decide.
You're right. It makes you question everything you're reading. And you know what? That kind of connects back to that scientific side of Poe we were talking about earlier. He loved to play with perception, to blur the lines between what's real and what's imagined.
Exactly. Like in the balloon hoax, even though it's presented as this factual account, right? It's a great example of that. Poe plays with the format of journalism, uses scientific language, these really detailed descriptions to create this incredibly convincing hoax. And, you know, for a while, people totally believed it.
He understood the power of a good story, how easily we can be drawn into something that confirms our suspicions, even if it turns out to be totally made up. It makes you wonder, what would he be doing with today's technology?
That's the great question. I mean, imagine the hoaxes he could pull off with the internet, the misinformation he could spread with a single tweet.
It's kind of terrifying to think about.
It is exhilarating and terrifying at the same time when you think about it, yeah.
But it makes his work feel surprisingly relevant, because we're constantly bombarded with information these days, trying to figure out what's real and what's fake. And in a way, Poe was grappling with that same problem back in the 1800s.
Oh, 100%. He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And his exploration of, the darker sides of human nature, our capacity for obsession, for cruelty, that continues to resonate, even today.
And speaking of that, we can't talk about Poe's legacy without talking about his influence on horror and the thriller genre. He's like the godfather of the modern thriller, wouldn't you say? Like
Mhm.
every time a writer uses an unreliable narrator or traps a character in some creepy old house, they're paying homage to Poe in a way.
Oh, for sure. And think about, like, all the psychological thrillers we see today, the way they tap into those really deep fears, our anxieties about technology, our place in the world. Poe was already exploring all those themes over a century ago.
It's true, which makes you wonder if Poe was writing today, what kind of terrors would he be digging up? What would a Poe story look like in this age of the internet, social media, AI, all that?
Oh, man. That's a fascinating thought experiment. Given his fascination with the human mind, I feel like he would be all over, well, the dark side of technology. Like maybe a story about how our constant need to be connected is actually isolating us, how algorithms are manipulating us, even driving us to madness.
Right, a chilling tale of social media obsession gone wrong, or maybe like a haunted AI that turns against its creator. Oh, Poe would have a field day with that.
Totally. Or what about like, oh, those darker corners of the internet, where anonymity just breeds cruelty and the line between reality and, well, fabrication, it's impossible to even see.
He could even give like a whole new meaning to the phrase going viral, right? I
Yeah.
can totally picture a Poe story about like a meme or something that takes on this sinister life of its own and just starts spreading like a digital plague.
It's a chilling thought. But it speaks to, the timelessness of his themes, I think. Fear, guilt, obsession, that human capacity for self-destruction.
Yeah.
Those are things that, well, they transcend any particular era or technology.
That's a really great point. So for our listeners out there, what can we take away from this deep dive into Poe? What's the lasting impact?
Well, hopefully it inspires you to, revisit his work or even discover it for the first time if you haven't already. But beyond that, I think Poe reminds us that, well, the monsters we create, whether they're lurking in the shadows or, in the digital world, they're often just reflections of our own inner darkness.
And that is a thought to keep you up at night. So next time you find yourself lost in a Poe story, remember, you're not just reading a horror story. You're getting a glimpse into the darker side of what it means to be human. Something that continues to fascinate and, yeah, even terrify us all these centuries later.